Please be seated. Today's story from the Gospel of John leaves me wondering. In particular, I wonder about Lazarus. Who was this man for whom Jesus wept? What was so special about him that Jesus chose to raise him from the dead? How did Lazarus know Jesus? Had he been a faithful follower, a relative? What did he do with his life after Jesus raised him from the dead? We can look to the whole story in the Gospel of John for a little more information. The evangelist tells us that Lazarus was from Bethany. He was the brother of Mary and Martha, and that they were followers of Jesus. That's pretty much all the backstory we get. After he was raised, the gospel briefly continues Lazarus' story. He was there at dinner when Mary anointed Jesus with her costly perfume. And we learn that the Pharisees were plotting to kill Lazarus because as a result of his resurrection, so many people were believing in Jesus. That wasn't very nice. And that's really about all we know from the gospel about Lazarus. Of course, there are also some other traditions and legends about him. The Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches have passed it down that Lazarus lived about 30 more years before he ultimately died again. He became a bishop of the early church, either the Bishop of Kidon or the Bishop of Marseille, depending on which story you're reading. In several locations today, there are reliquaries visited by pilgrims purportedly housing what remains of this miracle. The most interesting little tidbit that I found was that the stories say that he never again in his life smiled. I don't know why. Well, it's not much. And a part of me wishes I could issue an appeal to the gospel writer. Tell us more about Lazarus. We'd like to know his story. But then again, Lazarus wasn't the story that the gospel writer wanted to tell. John's story is about Jesus. The raising of Lazarus here is the last of the signs in the Gospel of John, beginning with transforming water into wine. Jesus has been all about revealing his identity, and to be more exact, revealing God's identity for the sake of the world. So Jesus goes on from turning water into wine to then healing a royal official's son and making a lame man walk. He feeds the 5,000 and walks over the surface of the water. He allows a man blind from birth to see. And finally, we come to this. He raises Lazarus from the dead, revealing in the process that in him, not even death will destroy us. John tells this story not because of who Lazarus is, but because of how Christ, through Lazarus, reveals the power and love of God for all of us. If this is a story that is at all about Lazarus, it is the story of a saint. A saint. Samuel Wells has said that some stories feature heroes and some stories feature saints, and the difference between them matters. He says stories told with heroes at the center of them are told to laud the virtues of the heroes. For if the hero failed, all would be lost. By contrast, a saint can fail in a way that the hero can't, because the failure of the saint reveals the forgiveness and the new possibilities made in God. And the saint is just a small character in a story that is always fundamentally about God. So Lazarus died, and Jesus wept. For reasons lost to us today, Jesus loved Lazarus and mourned the loss of his friend. Yet he also used Lazarus, this saint, to reveal for the rest of us that death will not be the end of our story. Death will not bind us because Christ will set us free. Today we celebrate the Feast of All Saints. It is a day to remember all those faithful people whom we have loved and for whom we have wept. It is a day to renew our baptismal covenant, recommitting ourselves to a life shaped by God's eternal love for us. And these are good and faithful things for us to do, but I think the greatest challenge of All Saints is to remember that we are saints too. As saints, the stories of our lives will not ultimately be about us. As saints, our role is to allow the gospel to again be told to the world through us. As saints, Christ will work through our lives to reveal again the power of God's love. Our stories become Christ's story. So whenever I preach or prepare to preach a sermon for a funeral, I try to look upon my task as something akin to the author of the Gospel of John writing about Lazarus. My job is not to tell the story of Lazarus, but to tell the story of Jesus through Lazarus. So I frequently ask the grieving family to tell me something about their loved one, especially if I did not know them well. But I don't ask them to tell me about their career or their accomplishments. Instead, I ask them, how did he reveal God's love for you? In what ways were the gospel story revealed in her life? How did you experience the grace of God in him? That's the story that needs to be told. That is the story that ultimately matters most about all of our loved ones and about us too. At the end of our time here in this life, most of us will probably not be remembered as martyrs or as heroes. But some of us will be remembered for our deep compassion for the suffering. Some of us will be remembered for the ways that we selflessly served others. Some of us will be remembered because we challenged the people around us to be faithful, and yet others will be remembered because of their extraordinary generosity. Some of us will even be fortunate enough to reveal for the world just how great the mercy of God can be. You are the pulpit from which the gospel is preached. You are the saints. There's a country church in England with a plaque on the wall that reads, "In the days of the Long Parliament, when all things religious were either devastated or destroyed, Sir Robert Shirley built this church. Let it be his legacy that he did the best things in the worst times and hoped them in the most calamitous." I know nothing else about Sir Robert Shirley, but I contend that he was a saint. And let this be our legacy too, that we build up Christ's church, that we do the best things in the worst times and hope them in the most calamitous, and trust God to do the rest. Because by the grace of God, even we who enter this place as sinners can leave as saints. Amen.